Hello everyone. You know, while I like video games from all kinds of different developers, I have to admit that I have a particularly soft spot for Nintendo. Like many gamers, I'm sure, Nintendo is specifically one of the main reasons I became a fan of video games in the first place. They were the ones who introduced me to video games, many of which plenty would consider to be brilliantly designed and would be from series that I personally love to this day. And yet, for as brilliant as they are as a creative force, they tend to be equally baffling as a business entity. Why do I say that? Well, you see, pretty much everybody is well aware that Nintendo has plenty of successful franchises, and among those successful franchises, the Mario series reigns supreme. Mario has been in multiple different genres, nearly all of which have been successful to an insane degree. However, it's the Mario platformers that stand head and shoulders above nearly all the other Mario-related series. And within that category, specifically the 2D side-scrolling Mario platformers, stand at the top of the mountain. Oh sure, the 3D Mario platformers have been very successful in their own right, and certainly in the 3D space, they have no equal. But the 2D platformers are, impressively enough, orders of magnitude more successful than their 3D counterparts for the most part. From the very first Super Mario Bros. To Super Mario World, all have been wildly successful to an insane degree. Super Mario Bros. 3 was the best-selling standalone game for years until GTA 4 came along. And the original Super Mario Bros. Was the best-selling game of all time until it would finally have its crown taken by Wii Sports more than 20 years later. Even the less successful Mario titles, like Super Mario Bros. 2, achieved numbers that 99% of video game developers would absolutely kill for. The point being is that these are some of the most incredibly financially successful titles in the history of video games. And yet, despite this unbelievable level of success, Nintendo actually went eons after Super Mario World without creating another side-scrolling Mario platformer. Why would they do that? Well, according to Nintendo legend and Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, one reason why they didn't bother was because they had developers like Rare making games like Donkey Kong Country, which Nintendo felt fulfilled that little niche. Now look, no offense to Rare and the Donkey Kong Country games, because those games are indeed amazing, and I'm absolutely glad that they exist. But they're not supposed to be a replacement for Mario. They're great supplements, absolutely, but not replacements. Also, I'm quite doubtful of the logic behind Miyamoto's comments, because the last Donkey Kong Country game made before Retro Studios took over was all the way back in 1996. So either way, we still had a massive gap in time go by before the next 2D Mario title appeared. Now, as far as the excuse with regards to them being focused on working on 3D Marios, that also doesn't seem like a satisfying reason. If you want to tell me that Nintendo didn't have too many resources at the time and adding another 2D Mario title to the mix would have spread the development teams too thin, it seems like a reasonable excuse. But it's one that's immediately undermined by the fact that Nintendo felt like they could dedicate resources to something like Yoshi's Story. Furthermore, after Mario 64 was released, development for the next Mario game, Super Mario Sunshine, wouldn't begin until 4 years later. And then after Sunshine, development for its sequel, Super Mario Galaxy, wouldn't happen for another 2.5 years. The point is that Nintendo weren't exactly going all Madden NFL or Call of Duty on 3D Marios. Furthermore, you would definitely think that Nintendo would want systems like the Nintendo 64 and GameCube, systems that weren't exactly doing that hot compared to previous Nintendo consoles, to receive all the help they could get. But whatever Nintendo's reasons happen to be, the fact of the matter is, fans of 2D Mario would go through a criminally long dry spell. In fact, some of us thought that Nintendo may not make another 2D Mario ever again. At least until one fateful day in the summer of 2004, during the highly anticipated Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 as it was commonly known. A new prominent face would be introduced to the world of gaming that day. The man who would become a meme, Reggie Fils-Aimé, appeared on stage to introduce to the world Nintendo's newest creation, a little device that would come to be known as the Nintendo DS. An innovative little machine at the time, the system was equipped with 2 screens, with the lower screen being a touchscreen, a relatively novel concept at the time. People were immediately intrigued. But what's a new, even potentially innovative gaming machine without software? And it was here where Nintendo would release a trailer for one of its upcoming heavy hitters, Something that many Nintendo fans had been clamoring for, the first footage of the first brand new 2D Mario game in more than a decade. Interestingly enough, the first teaser was remarkably rough looking and very uncharacteristically Nintendo-like. I mean, there's a bunch of placeholder graphics everywhere, and the question mark blocks don't even animate. Still, while it was a very brief and rough trailer, it was still way more than enough to get the hype train chugging. There wasn't much in the trailer, but one noteworthy thing was the introduction of a new power-up, the Mega Mushroom, which, unlike the regular Super Mushroom, would allow Mario to become not just big, but become king-sized, and powerful enough to destroy anything in his path, like an Italian version of the Juggernaut. Before we go any further, I feel like it's important to also go over the context in which this announcement was made. So, Nintendo's adorable purple lunchbox, the GameCube, wasn't doing too hot in terms of sales. In fact, it was doing even worse than the Nintendo 64, not to mention it was competing neck and neck with the new kid on the block, which was not a good look for a company that once reigned supreme over the video game world. And never mind that both were being absolutely annihilated by the new number one. So both the DS and New Super Mario Bros. Weren't just simply new iterations of hardware and software Nintendo have made. No, these were supposed to be emblematic of a new era of Nintendo, one that would attempt to avoid the mistakes of the GameCube. Yes, I understand that a handheld is not a console, so technically not the successor to the GameCube, but it was the start of what would later be dubbed by Nintendo as their Blue Ocean strategy, the strategy that they would carry on to the actual successor of the GameCube, the Wii. It was both kind of a soul-crushing, but also a really exciting time to be a Nintendo fan. So both the Nintendo DS and New Super Mario Bros. Had a lot riding on them. Still, while as ecstatic as Mario fans were at this news, we would still unfortunately have to wait another 2 years before any of us would get a chance to play the game. During that time, Nintendo would allow more and more information about the game to trickle out, and we would learn that in addition to the Mega Mushroom, Mario would have 2 additional new power-ups. The Mini Mushroom, which is exactly what it sounds like, was the exact opposite of the Mega Mushroom, instead allowing Mario to become tiny enough that he'd be able to run on water and fit into small enclosed spaces that normal-sized Mario wouldn't be able to access. And the other power-up was the Blue Shell power-up, which would allow Mario to skid around inside a Koopa Troopa shell. Admittedly, I personally wasn't really quite impressed with this selection of new power-ups, but it didn't matter, and I was still stoked for the game regardless. So now let's talk about the development behind the game. With the brand new Mario platformer, it would only make sense that the project would be headed by the 2 men responsible for creating him, the aforementioned Shigeru Miyamoto and his equally legendary right-hand man, Takashi Tezuka. 2 other veterans of the original Mario team also returned to contribute to the project. One was Toshihiko Nakago, the programming director of every previous 2D Mario game, a man who, alongside Miyamoto and Tezuka, were referred to as the Golden Triangle of the Mario series, would resume his role as programming director for New Super Mario Bros. The other was Koji Kondo, the genius music composer who had also worked on every 2D Mario platformer up until this point. Unfortunately, but also unsurprisingly, there were also a number of developers from the original Mario team that wouldn't return. Again, not to belabor the point, but 13 years had gone by the time development began on New Super Mario Bros. And in that time, many members of the original staff had been promoted several times and moved on to their own personal projects that they were now in charge of. Hideki Kono, who was responsible for designing the world maps of Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, was now promoted to producer and was mainly in charge of the Mario Kart series. Katsuya Iguchi, who was responsible for the level designs in those games, was also promoted to producer, and he would be focusing his efforts on the Animal Crossing series. Furthermore, it should also be pointed out that while the likes of Miyamoto, Tezuka, and Kondo returned, they were there mostly in a more managerial and advisory role than specifically a creative one. No, the nuts and bolts for this game would be handled by a newer generation of Nintendo developers. Instead of Miyamoto or Tezuka, the game would be directed by a little-known designer at the time, named Shigeyuki Asuke. Asuke was a relative newcomer to not just the Mario series, but Nintendo itself, first working on games like Luigi's Mansion and Pikmin as a debugger. Asuke quickly rose through the ranks, working on multiple games in the Super Mario Advance series as a map designer, before finally making his directorial debut with New Super Mario Bros. He would lead a small army of mostly novice artists and designers to craft the characters, levels, and worlds for this new game. Koji Kondo would contribute a few songs, but would mainly act as sound director, leaving main composing duties to Nintendo newcomer Asuka Oda, who started work at Nintendo in 2003, and Hajime Wakai, another long-standing Nintendo composer who worked on Star Fox 64, F-Zero X, and Pikmin, to name a few. The last side-scrolling Mario game, Super Mario World, would have around 15 developers working on it. New Super Mario Bros., on the other hand, had over 50, and took over 2 years of development time. The game may have been called New Super Mario Bros., but one of the goals, according to Takashi Tezuka, was to go back to basics. This game was not exactly keen on rewriting the rulebook, but rather just simply trying to take what was good about Mario and distill it to its fundamentals. Pretty much every previous mainline Mario title had its own distinct graphical style, and New Super Mario Bros. Would continue that tradition. Little did we know at the time that ironically we'd be stuck with this new style for a while. Instead of the 2D hand-drawn sprites that all the prior Mario games had used up until now, New Super Mario Bros. Would instead go with 3D models with 2D backgrounds. A consequence of using this particular graphical choice was the ability to make it much easier for Mario to do various moves, many of which had been directly taken from Mario's 3D outings, like the triple jump, wall jump, and ground pounds. The game would come with an assortment of new music tracks. As mentioned, Koji Kondo took a step back to leave main composing duties to the other members of the sound team. However, he did compose the theme for the main overworld in the introductory levels. A somewhat neat feature of the game's soundtrack was that certain enemies like Goombas and Koopa Troopas would dance to the music. The game also had additional content, like a plethora of minigames, though many of which were ripped directly from Super Mario 64 DS. Finally, there was a new addition, which was a 2-player co-op mode, something that hadn't been done since the original Mario Bros. For the NES. I was religiously following this game's development until release. I was very intrigued to see how it was going to perform. Some people might say, well, it's Mario. Of course it's going to do great. But that's too simplistic thinking. Super Mario 64 sold around 12 million units, a number that I'm sure Nintendo was fairly pleased with. However, the game's follow-up, Super Mario Sunshine, which was also the most recent Mario platformer prior to New Super Mario Bros., sold less than half of that, at around 5 million by the time New Super Mario Bros. Came out. That is a big drop-off. And yes, some might point out that one big reason for that discrepancy is that the GameCube itself sold 10 million fewer units than the Nintendo 64. And yes, it might have been safe to say that, at the very least, New Super Mario Bros. Would have sold better than Sunshine, for a variety of reasons. But need I remind everybody once again that by the time this game would have been released, it would have been 15 years since Super Mario World came out, with its incredible 20 million unit performance. Now granted, to be fair, I should point out that Super Mario World was packed in with a lot of Super Nintendos. But that's okay, because we can still go to its older brother, Super Mario Bros. 3, which as a standalone Mario, sold over 18 million units. Was New Super Mario Bros. Going to get anywhere near that? True, even the most pessimistic predictions would have had New Super Mario Bros. Being a guaranteed multi-million seller. But could it achieve the phenomenal levels of success that its big brothers had achieved? That was the question. And the answer to that question was a resounding yes. Yes, it would. New Super Mario Bros. Would miss the launch of the DS by 2 years, though the system wouldn't launch without a Mario game. It would just be from New Super Mario Bros. 3D cousin, Super Mario 64 DS. However, New Super Mario Bros. Would launch alongside Nintendo's first major revision of the DS, that being the soon-to-be very incredibly popular DS Lite. The original DS was somewhat big and clunky looking, but the DS Lite was small and sleek, with Nintendo taking a page from Apple's playbook. And it was with this combination that would make New Super Mario Bros. Achieve a level of success that I don't think anybody within Nintendo or outside Nintendo would have imagined even in their most optimistic projections. When the game was released in Japan, on the first day it sold over 400,000 units. Over the course of 3 days, that number went up to 900,000. When it was released in the US, it sold over 1 million units in its first month. Now granted, that last number might not seem impressive compared to how it was doing in Japan, but fortunately for Nintendo, the game would be a slow but consistent seller for years to come. It sold so well, in fact, that when all was said and done, the game wound up moving a phenomenal 31 million units. Absolutely unheard of for a standalone Mario. It absolutely crushed both Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World easily. The question regarding whether people still had interest in a 2D Mario after all these years was soundly answered. I don't want to say that New Super Mario Bros. Success was an obvious thing. I mean, I expected it to do very well, for sure. Really well, in fact, but not this well. Some of the factors towards the game's success are probably obvious when spelled out. But why did it sell this remarkably well? 2D Mario has some inherent advantages over its 3D brethren. For one thing, 2D games are far more accessible than the 3D ones. Nintendo tries to make their games as accessible to a wide range of audiences as possible. However, even Nintendo can only do so much. For 3D games, the additional dimension can make things much more difficult to navigate, and thus can make people get lost quite easily. Not only do you have to move forwards and backwards, left and right, but also up and down. On top of that, 3D games have the inherent issue of dodgy cameras, making things difficult for the player to see as well as causing disorientation. 2D platformers, on the other hand, are very straightforward. In fact, they are one of the most straightforward genres in the entirety of video games. When I was little, I would play games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World with my female cousins at the time. They weren't super into video games, but they did love Mario, and he was one of the few exceptions that they could genuinely enjoy. But then Mario 64 came out, and whatever interest they may have had with Mario went away very quickly with his move to the third dimension. Even for myself, as someone I would describe as a hardcore gamer, actually took me a very long time to properly get accustomed to Mario 64. That Blue Ocean strategy that I mentioned earlier, it was an attempt by Nintendo to broaden their base by attempting to appeal to that very audience, one that may have in fact included disaffected gamers like my cousins. New Super Mario Bros. Is one of those games that appeal to both casual and hardcore fans alike. This is exactly the kind of game that my female cousins would feel right at home playing, even all grown up with their families. New Super Mario Bros. Was not only extremely successful, but it was also very influential within Nintendo itself, spawning multiple games using the exact same style and physics. Yes, they had certain features to distinguish themselves, but every single one of those games worked from the exact same base. But alas, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbow roads in the Mushroom Kingdom. While New Super Mario Bros. Initially received rave reviews, when the hype died down, people were able to look at the game with more discerning eyes. Some people questioned the decision to go with 3D models on a system that wasn't particularly well equipped for such. The lack of both horsepower and features like texture filtering made Mario and the other NPCs look very pixelated and aliased. While the game had some decent tunes, the overall soundtrack was a disappointment compared to previous Mario titles. Though I will say that the main castle theme is a definite banger. The power-ups seemed like either gimmicks as the novelty wore off real quick, or just too cumbersome and unruly to use. The level design was pretty good, but nothing to brag about. While a lot of us, myself included, were hyped to the stratosphere for this game, the unfortunate truth was that the final product left a lot to be desired. Far from being a return to form, this just turned out to be a solid, but flawed Mario title. This was not the long-awaited 2D Mario platformer that Mario fans were hoping for. Indeed, despite the fact that it retains the highest Metacritic score out of any of the games in the new series, New Super Mario Bros. Appears to be one of the least liked entries in the series, being beaten perhaps only by its immediate sequel, New Super Mario Bros. 2 for the 3DS. Fortunately though, while New Super Mario Bros. For the DS may have disappointed a lot of us, the next game in the series would attempt to fix nearly all its mistakes, and that game, one that I personally will have much more to say about, will be the topic of an upcoming video. So look forward to it. So once again, thank you for watching my video, and if you like my content, please like and subscribe, and if you can, donate to my Patreon. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.